I'm an Uber driver, and I've seen some strange things in the 4 years I've been doing it. The story, however, is about the scariest night of my life. It's also probably the closest I've ever come to death, and it only happened last month. I was working late at night. My city's under 1 million in population, so it's far from a bustling metropolis. It's big enough so that there's always something to do, but small enough so that it's not that hard to escape the commotion. It's a relatively short drive before you're in the country or in the forest. I really like that. I picked up a passenger at around midnight on Saturday night, so Sunday morning, I guess. He was a little younger than me, I thought so anyway. I'm 28, and I would say that this guy was 25 max. He was around 5'8" and clean-shaven with a buzzed head. He was thin, with big, bug-like eyes. He got into my car and barely acknowledged me. That was fine with me, because I don't need to be talking all the time. His destination was in an area that I didn't know very well, and it was outside the city, in a rural park. It would be around a 30-minute drive to get there. While I was driving, I looked at my passenger in the rearview mirror. He hardly said a word to me so far. I didn't mind the silence, but something about this guy was troubling. I'm used to all kinds of passengers. Drunk people are probably the most common at this time of night anyway. But this guy wasn't drunk. I would know. I've developed a sense for that kind of thing in my line of work. He was absorbed with his phone, and he had a look on his face that worried me. It looked like anger, almost like a manager who was angry with his workers. I wondered what he was doing, but it was none of my business, so I just kept driving. I took a turn onto a country road. The smooth pavement was replaced with rough gravel. I could feel the change immediately. There were no streetlights, but the moon was full, so I could see a fair distance ahead. I glanced at the map on my phone and noticed that his final destination was not too far. There was nothing out there, a cornfield to the right and a forest to the left. "Hey, buddy," I asked, "are you sure this is right?" "We're almost there," he replied, the first full sentence I'd gotten out of him. After a few minutes, I saw a light in the distance. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but as I got closer, I could tell that it was a truck. There was a man in the front seat. I could just barely see him. I stopped in front of the truck, and my passenger jumped out. He shut the door and jumped into the truck. I turned my car around and started heading back. I was really confused, though. Why would somebody get an Uber to a truck in the middle of nowhere? Why wouldn't his friend just pick him up? I didn't know why, but I didn't care at the time. I was about half a mile from where I'd let him out when I lost control of my car. It was like all 4 tires burst at the same time. I swerved left and right, struggling to stay on the road. Eventually, I came to a stop. I sat there in the driver's seat for a few seconds to compose myself, and then I got out to check what happened. Sure enough, all 4 of my tires were flat. There's no way that that was a coincidence. Something was wrong. Without thinking, I ran into the woods, which were next to the road. I hid behind a tree and waited. After a minute or two, a pair of bright headlights appeared behind my car. It was the truck from before. Now there were 3 men sitting in the truck. One was my passenger, another was the guy who I saw before, and then there was a third. They stopped in front of my car, and when they did, I remembered that I left my phone in my car. I almost cursed out loud, but I stopped myself. By that point, I was pretty sure that I'd fallen into a trap. Those guys must have popped my tires somehow. Maybe the third guy put out a spike strip or something after I passed on my way. The 3 guys got out of the truck and walked over to my car. The front door was still open. "Where is he?" one of them said. "He can't be far," another added. After I heard that, I feared for my life, so I pulled my head behind the tree to avoid being seen. The men continued to talk, and I could also hear them going through my car. I was kicking myself for not taking my phone. I was pretty sure there was service on my way in. I wouldn't have been surprised, though, if this was a small dead patch that they had planned. Still, it was a stupid mistake to leave it. After another few minutes, the truck drove away. I was relieved because I thought they would try to find me. I was able to get a clear look at the truck, and all 3 men were there. This was my chance. I started walking through the woods. It would be at least an hour-long walk to get back to the main road this way, but I couldn't take the road and risk being caught. I eventually made it to the road and flagged down a car. I had the driver call 911 for me. The police met me at the side of the road, and I told them what happened. We went to a rest stop to discuss further. One of the officers called for backup, and they went to the spot where it happened. When the officer got back, one of the cops told me that there was nothing there. At first, I thought he went to the wrong place, but then he showed me some pictures that he'd taken of the scene. It was the right spot. The skid marks from my burst tires were there, and everything. Those guys stole my car. I never found out why they let me go. It wouldn't have been hard for them to find me. I'm thankful to have survived, and although my tormentors have not been found yet, I still have hope. This happened a few years ago. I used to drive for Uber, but only part-time. I had a good full-time job, but I worked from home and had hardly any real-life interaction with other people. I thought it'd be good for me to get out there and get away from my apartment for a few hours once in a while. After this incident, though, I quit and never looked back. I headed out at around 8 p.m., as I usually did. Things were slow, and I only had 2 passengers in the first hour. One was a group of college-aged girls who seemed to be going to some kind of party, even though it was a Tuesday night. The other was a single woman who I think was a waitress on her way home from work. After that, I sat idle for 10 or 20 minutes. Eventually, I got a ride request. The user had no rating, which itself isn't a huge red flag. Everyone has to take their first ride at some point, but it wasn't usual. I accepted it and drove to the pickup spot, which would take around 10 minutes. It was actually not that far from my apartment. In fact, I passed my building on the way. I got to the spot and pulled my car over to the side of the road. There was nobody there, so I sent a message to my passenger, whose name was Telly. That's what it said anyway. A few seconds after I sent the message, I got a reply. "Be right there," it said, albeit with really poor grammar. I sat there waiting for a few minutes. Usually, I take off after 10 minutes. I kept my eye on the clock, and after 7.5 minutes, a man approached my car. He introduced himself as Telly and got in. He was probably in his early 20s, with a long beard and wild, bushy hair. He was slightly overweight and wore a pair of thin-framed glasses. I usually try to start a conversation with my passengers. Some of you may think that's annoying, but I don't care. "How's your night going?" I asked. Fine," Telly said. The tone in his voice told me that he didn't want to talk, so I backed off and kept driving. Telly had his eyes on his phone for the most part, but he would periodically look out the window in a troubling way, like he was worried about something. Another thing I noticed was that he was nervous. He was shaking and sweating. I think he had even been crying recently, but maybe it was just from stress. I was starting to feel nervous with him in my back seat, so I periodically watched him through the rearview mirror as often as I could. I thought he was on drugs or something. I glanced at him again. His hands were gripping his phone. This time, I noticed that there were traces of blood on his hands and some clear cuts on his knuckles. I also noticed a blood stain on his shirt. I was feeling really creeped out, but the destination was fast approaching, so I figured I would be gone soon. We stopped at the destination, which was just McDonald's. Telly got out and mumbled, "Thanks," on his way out. I called it a night after that. I drove home and went to bed. The next day, when I was at my desk working, I heard a loud knock at my door. I stood up and walked there and looked at the people. 2 police officers stood in front of my door. My heart sank into my stomach, and my mind raced while I tried to think of what it could be about. I opened the door cautiously and didn't say a word. One of the officers told me that they were searching for a suspect who was wanted for a mugging and brutal beating of an elderly man. As soon as he told me that, I thought of Telly. They then showed me a picture, and it was him. I then told the police everything I knew. I showed them the record on my Uber account and even gave them my dashcam footage. Telly was caught that day, but I'm not sure what happened to him after that. I tried to find some news articles about the incident, but there weren't any. I stopped driving shortly after this incident. It can be really dangerous out there for drivers, and it's simply not worth it to me anymore. My name is Jane, and I'm in my last year of graduate school studying pharmacology. I do my best work late at night, so I often spend my evenings studying at the library, usually until it's quite late. At my school, the library is open until midnight most nights of the week. During the last month of each semester, it's open all night. So, it wasn't uncommon for me to stay there until 2 or even 3 in the morning. It was a large, modern, 4-story building with a computer area on the main floor. The other floors were packed with bookshelves and various study areas scattered between. I would always try to find a quiet area where nobody would bother me. I was there late on a Thursday night. To be honest, I wasn't getting very much done. I had my laptop out and was really just watching YouTube videos, so I decided to call it a night. By then, it was well past midnight, so I knew the buses wouldn't be running anymore. My place was way too far to walk and would also be too dangerous to walk alone at this hour. I decided to call an Uber, which I often did when I was there late. I packed up my stuff and walked out the large glass doors at the front of the library. As I stood there waiting, I looked at my phone to keep an eye on the status of my ride. It wasn't long before a red sedan pulled up to me. I got in and said hello to the driver. The driver was a man in his mid-30s. He had an unkempt beard, thick glasses, and a winter hat, even though it was April. I would say that his style was that of a hipster. He said hi back to me, and when we started driving, I was playing a game on my phone. The driver tried to talk to me a few times, but I brushed him off and turned back to my game. He clearly wanted to talk, but I just wasn't in the mood. Eventually, he seemed to take the hint, and we just kept going. I didn't get any really creepy vibes at that point. We made it to my place without incident, and he dropped me off in front. I had a first-floor apartment in an old house, and it was divided up by floor. I had neighbors above and below, each with a separate entrance. I got out of the car and thanked the driver flippantly, then shut the door and walked into my apartment. I looked back before I closed my door, and the guy was still sitting there. He was directly under a streetlight, and he was looking up at me, but as soon as he saw that I noticed him, he turned away. I closed my door and then went to bed and fell asleep right away. Over the next week, I started to feel like I was being watched while I was at home. Like I said, my place was on the ground floor of a house. My bedroom was at the back, and my window overlooked an alley that didn't get much foot traffic. However, recently, I started to see a dark figure walking by my window frequently. It didn't alarm me at first, but one night I thought I saw him trying to look in through my window. I always kept the curtains closed, but I could see through a little bit. I walked over to the window, but when I got close, the figure disappeared. At this point, I was creeped out, and I thought I was being stalked, but I couldn't prove it. I was worried that if I told anybody, they would think I was just crazy, so I kept it to myself. Not long after that, I was studying late at the library again. It was around 11:30 when I decided to call it a night. I called an Uber and waited in front of the building like usual. I was feeling paranoid this time, so I decided to enter an address that was a block or so away from my actual address. That way, the driver wouldn't know where I live. When my ride pulled up, it was that same red sedan as before. I hadn't remembered the guy until I saw him again. I had used Uber for this trip a few times, and this was the first time that I'd seen the same driver again. When I got into the car, he seemed surprised to see me. Our eyes connected through the rearview mirror, and a chill went down my spine. I don't know why, but he really creeped me out this time. The car started to move, though, so I figured I would just take the ride. I was relieved when he dropped me off in front of my place. I crossed the road and opened my front door. Then I went to bed. When I was lying in bed trying to sleep, I realized something. I had put in a nearby address as my destination, but the driver dropped me off right in front of my place. Perhaps he had a good memory, but even still, I thought they were supposed to just follow the app. I eventually fell asleep. After what felt like an hour or so, I woke up to a banging sound on my window. I sprung up, startled by the noise. I scurried to the other side of my room to get away from it. I watched in horror as a dark shadow behind my curtains moved outside my window. The noise continued. It was like somebody was trying to force it open. I spotted my phone laying on my bed, so I ran over and grabbed it, then dialed 911. I ran out to my living room and quietly closed the door to my bedroom, and I moved the couch in front of it. The police arrived in minutes. They managed to catch my would-be attacker in the act. One of the officers met me at the front of my house. He tried to calm me down on the porch. Just then, I saw another officer with a man in handcuffs. It was that creepy driver from before. I bet you didn't see that coming. I thanked the police officers for arriving so quickly. Otherwise, that guy may have gotten away. I stayed with a friend that night and for the next few nights. I moved out of that place soon after, and now I have a roommate.